You're going to need a pair of pliers. You're going to need a drill bit that's 1.5 millimeters to 1.65 millimeters thick. You're going to need a toothpick so that you can hold the Teflon needle bearing at the end of it. And that's it. Now, what I thought I would start off by doing is explaining what the Teflon needle bearing is and where it's located in the airbrush. And you'll see here on this cutaway view that the Teflon needle bearing is a seal that's inside the airbrush, located just here. This is the Teflon needle bearing, and this seal is very, very important to the performance of the airbrush. What that does is stop air being sucked in, drawn in by the venturi created at the front of the airbrush, so that it will draw paint from the jar or colour cup. If for any reason this seal is loose, instead of sucking the paint from the colour cup or the jar, it will do what atmosphere always does when it's trying to equalise. It will take the path of least resistance, and instead of drawing the paint out of your jar or colour cup, it'll just draw air through this back here. You'll know when this Teflon needle bearing is loose because your flow while you're airbrushing, while you're working away, will give you a really uneven flow. It will, but in a rhythmic way. It'll give you a line and then chug, and then give you a line and then chug, give you a line, chug. And it's that rhythmic break that is the telltale sign that this Teflon needle bearing is too loose. Now, while we're here, what is important to be looking at is the tiny little brass nodules just there and there, just top and bottom. And in this model, the nodules are at the back, but in the 150 airbrushes, the nodules are at the front. Now, these nodules are what we're going to press the actual Teflon seal up against, and they are actually what bite the needle bearing up against the needle. Okay, I'm going to take the handle off the airbrush. I'm going to loosen the needle chuck. Note the way I again hold the airbrush with the air valve coming down the middle of my four fingers, thumb on the trigger. Just give that a quarter turn only, take the needle out, and then I take the head off, and what I've got to do now is remove the entire rear spring assembly. I can take the trigger out and take the back lever off. So, what we've got so far is the head and the needle, the trigger, back lever and rear spring assembly, and that's basically the body is now stripped down except for the air valve, which we're not going to be working on. We're not going to be taking anything off that section there. We're only going to be working on the internal seal. Now, the seal, I'm going to press the old one out using the long shaft of the drill bit, and I'm just going to press it on the actual table there, press down and push out the old needle bearing. So there is the actual needle bearing itself. Little tiny, tiny seal. Now that little tiny seal is very, very important, and it must make sure that it bites onto the actual needle itself. So I've got the new one over here on a toothpick ready to go, and I'm now going to insert it into place. So I place that right down in there, and you can see inside the actual trigger slot that I'm pushing it right through. And I'm going to push it in and wedge it in and twist the toothpick, hopefully be able to get the toothpick off it. Yes, there we are. And now I'm going to use the drill bit to press it into place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press against, I'm going to use the flat end here of the pliers, and I'm going to press against the drill bit just a little bit, just to wedge it up against the little nodules that I spoke of earlier. Well, when I say a nodule, it's not actually a nodule, it's a ring. It's a ring inside the actual the drilled hole where the needle bearing goes. Now, in pressing it in, I may have over-tensioned it. I may have pressed it up against that ring, those nodules that I showed you earlier, a little too hard. And we'll know in a moment. What I do is I put the rear spring assembly back in again as a guide for the needle. So that's all wound in. And I just undo the needle chuck again. And again, you'll note that I have the air valve coming down the middle of my 4 fingers so that I can span this finger out and guide the needle in. And I'm going to slide it through and check the actual tension. And the tension is too loose. It hasn't been pressed in enough. And it seems to be a case of one or the other. You've got to fiddle with it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually try and purposely over-tension it, and then I'll show you how we can actually even loosen the needle bearing as well. So I've pressed it in quite hard, and again I'm going to put this assembly back in. And again, test the tension by putting the needle in. Okay, now it's quite tough. It's actually, you can really feel that it's got to the seal. You can actually see the airbrush moving as the needle strikes the seal. The reason for putting the assembly back together again is so that I wanted you to understand that if the needle bearing is too tight, that when you pull back on the trigger and let go, the actual needle won't return. It'll actually stay back. Instead of going forward, it'll actually stay back here. And it's very important that the needle is going to move correctly backwards and forwards. Now, if for any reason the needle bearing is too tight, I find the simplest and quickest way of loosening it is to just pull the needle out until it's almost all the way, but still the last bit of it's inside the seal, and then I just rotate that 360 degrees, and that usually loosens it, and then I push it back through again. And that usually sets the tension of the needle passing through the bearing just perfectly. Again, if it's still too tight, pull it through, turn it 360, and then pull it out. And what you're doing is you're just trying to compress the Teflon needle bearing until it's just the right tension. It's not a perfect system. These are just simply hints to help you get through some of the smaller problems that can occur. But I hope this is helpful to you.